Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for a very special talk this afternoon. This is the last event of the semester for the KU Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the final installment of our Legacies of the Cold War, Russia, the United States, and the World series, which has been supported by a grant from the Russia Foundation. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Fiona Hill as our last speaker of the semester. And we are so thankful that she's sharing her time with us during a very busy period in U.S.-Russian relations. I also want to thank the CREES team for helping to organize her virtual visit, Ezra Predolotz, Lisa Gillian, Amanda Hill. And finally, I want to say a very special thanks to the late Dr. Jacob Kipp, who has been a longtime member of our CREES community and who helped connect us with Dr. Hill in the first place. And we will be having a public, helping participate in a public ceremony honoring his legacy in the spring. Dr. Fiona Hill is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She studied Russian and history at the University of St. Andrews and went on to a PhD in history at Harvard. Since receiving her doctorate, she worked at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the Eurasia Foundation, and the Brookings Institution, from where she took 2 leaves to fulfill important roles, first from 2006 to 2009 as an analyst on Russia and Eurasia on the National Intelligence Council, and then from 2017 to 2019 as a senior director for European and Russian affairs on the National Security Council. She testified in the first impeachment hearings in late 2019, and many of you may remember her striking testimony at the time on both her own experience and the importance of government service and on U.S.-Russia relations. She's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the author of several books on a variety of topics: Siberia, the Siberian Curse, which she co-authored with Clifford Gaddy, on oil and gas, energy empire, and on President Vladimir Putin, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Most recently, she's authored a more personal memoir of a work that combines biography and policy and an assessment of politics, society, and the economy, not just in Russia, but also across the globe, particularly in the UK and in the US. That book is There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, which was just published in October, and I highly recommend it. Dr. Hill draws some unexpected parallels between post-Thatcher, the UK, Russia under Putin, and contemporary America. So before we start, I just wanted to mention this is a Q&A session. So if you do have questions, feel free to enter them in the chat or use the Q&A function. I will be moderating the questions and we'll try my best to weave them into the conversation. I also have some questions of my own that I've been thinking about to ask Dr. Hill in light of her work. But I do encourage all of you out there in the virtual space to send in your questions through chat and the Q&A. So I guess my first question has to do with the title of this talk, which is presents dealing with Vladimir Putin as a domestic and a foreign policy challenge. And so I was really struck by your inclusion of the domestic and the foreign, and I wonder if you could say a few words about how you see those two fitting together in U.S.-Russia relations.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Eric. I'm really delighted to be here and just, so pleased that so many people could join here at the end of the semester. And I just want to give a shout out also to the late, great Jacob Kipp, who was just, one of the giants in the field of Soviet and post-Soviet studies, and someone who I admired greatly. And I'm just very sad that he's not here to participate in this with us today, because he would have always had an enormous amount to say. And when I was starting out as a young scholar here in the United States, he was always extraordinarily kind and generous and very affirming and encouraging. As I was saying to Eric before we started, he certainly didn't suffer fools gladly, and he had a lot of thoughts and opinions that he shared very widely. But he was just the most generous of colleagues and a really wonderful man. It's just an enormous loss to everyone. So my condolences to everyone who knew him and his family and friends, and everyone at CREES as well. I mean, we are actually having a discussion at quite the time. It's not just, and this, I'd like to frame it into your question here. It's not just that we're worrying right now that Russia might invade Ukraine for essentially, the third time in many respects in not so many years. But this is also the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 30th anniversary. And in many respects, that kind of frames the problem of dealing with Putin and Russia. Because 30 years ago, at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia lost a state for the second time in the 20th century. After the Russian Revolution, 1917, collapse of the Russian Empire, and then the unraveling of the Soviet Union in December 1991. And for people like Putin, who were on the ascendancy in terms of their career and their professional perspectives at that moment, I mean, he has said himself in interviews and in various writings, this was the great catastrophe of the 20th century, that loss of statehood. But of course, this was a larger empire, and his own loss of his own position, not just, as he said, Russia's position in Europe, but his own. I mean, he was within the KGB at that point. He'd been stationed abroad in East Germany. East Germany was disappearing. That was on the kind of the front line of the unraveling of the Soviet bloc. And he returned to Russia, to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it soon became, with the country on its back foot, and him uncertain as to where he was going to go. I mean, he would never have imagined 30 years ago that he would be the president of Russia. We wouldn't have either. And in fact, probably none of us would have imagined ourselves in these places. Some of you weren't born, 30 years ago. So, there's an awful lot there. And obviously, for other countries, including Ukraine, this was a period of great gain, not of loss. Russia lost. Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltic states, all the other constituent republics of the former Soviet Union gained independence and sovereignty and a whole new path forward. Now, of course, a lot of things have happened in that 30 years that lead to a lot of questions. And a lot of that has been pressure internally in all of these new polities, or not so new polities now, in trying to kind of find their own kind of balance in terms of their domestic politics. And so we spend a lot of time, those of us who look at the region, looking at the domestic foreign policy intertwining in all the states, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the kind of impact on domestic politics, and also in Russia itself, the domestic roots of foreign policy. And actually here we have in the United States the same thing, and that's why I framed it in this way. I talk about this in an article I wrote for Foreign Affairs. But look, we saw in 2016 an unprecedented intervention by Vladimir Putin and the security services in our domestic politics in the presidential election of that year. Now, it wasn't unprecedented in the sense that this is the first time that the Russians and the Russian intelligence and secret services have had a stage an intervention. In fact, what we saw had all the hallmarks of an old Soviet-style Cold War influence operation. Lots of propaganda, lots of stirring the pot, efforts to amplify discord, sow disorder through propagation of disinformation. But what happened was it had much more impact than anything that the Russians and the Soviets had ever previously done before, because the United States was incredibly vulnerable. I mean, it doesn't, from where you're sitting in Kansas, this just as much as I do sitting here in Maryland, on the edges of Washington, D.C., that we live in a divided country, a divided polity. People are taking sides. They're defining themselves now in terms of their party politics, as well as a myriad of other identities. The country is divided geographically. There's lots of spatial inequality. There's divisions within cities, urban areas as well, not just urban, rural divides. There's cleavages on every front. We are no longer in the position where we see ourselves as Americans engaged in a common purpose. And this has a long tail, and I describe this in the recent book that I've written, going back really to the 1980s, and the kind of changes in the economy, changes away from moving away from heavy industry, mass manufacturing, mass agriculture, move to a new economy, and the fact that some places move more quickly than others, demographic changes that we have here in the United States, where by 2045, the demographic profile of the United States is going to look more different than at any other time, majority minority in terms of population breakdown. And that's all being driven not by immigration, which is at the lowest point, in spite of what we see and hear about the southern borders, for example, but the lowest point in recent time because of all the restrictions on legal immigration, but it's been driven by birth rates, intermarriage birth rates, and other, social changes. But of course, some places are changing demographically more quickly than others as well. And all of this is creating a sense of rapid change and dislocation for people. Most people can't keep up with that, and they feel uncertain and insecure. And that's exactly what happened in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over the last 30 years, Russia changed rather dramatically. Period of really chaotic politics and economic collapse in the 1990s. Putin coming in saying he was going to fix it all, trying to kind of paper over a lot of divisions, polarization, partisan infighting, all kinds of similar, differences and divergences that emerged in Russia, including some demographic changes, because this had gone from being the Soviet Union with a myriad of different ethnic groups to a predominantly Russian federation, but also with a lot of different groups internally: Ukrainians, Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, and others, all with their own histories, all indigenous to Russia. Different religions that are all kind of part of that fabric, and a lot of tensions emerging. And how did you create a more synthetic, unified sense of what Russia is, which is the first thing that Putin did? We, on the other hand, always used to have a unified sense of America. We had the kind of the American dream that was at the bottom of that opportunity, which I talk about in the book. But now in the United States, quite different from 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's a kind of a sense that the opportunities aren't there for people. And in fact, they're right, because you only have a 7% chance in the United States these days of doing what I did, which is move from the very bottom of society to the top, socioeconomically. I grew up, admittedly not in the United States, but in the northeast of England, an old coal mining town, the equivalent of anywhere in West Virginia or Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley. My father was a miner who had lost his job over and over again. I was at the very bottom rung socioeconomically in the United Kingdom, and here I am at the top in the United States. I mean, the chance of that in most settings are quite small, but now in the United States, they're infinitesimally small. It's much more difficult to do what I did now for people of, your generation students. And it's that which is really kind of feeding in to a sense of grievance and frustration and all of the divisions. And that's the national security and foreign policy dilemma, because those were all exploited by the Russian services when they intervened in the election. They did their own polling. They took advantage of our polling. They created false personas on the internet. It wasn't just hacking and releasing of emails and trying to penetrate our electoral systems. It was trying to hack our minds, trying to figure out how they could manipulate public opinion. And because the election was so close in 2016, of course, was that suspicion at the back of many people's minds that somehow they'd affected the outcome, when in fact it was our votes, Americans' votes, that affected the outcome in the Electoral College. And had done in the past. We've had similar narrow outcomes in the Electoral College, but this time, with the Russians intervening in such an obvious way, it created chaos domestically. So now the challenge of dealing with Russia is twofold. It's in our domestic politics, getting them out of our politics, getting them out of our political discourse, getting them out of messing about in our domestic politics, and dealing within the foreign policy arena. And that's why I kind of framed it like that, because we're all part of this as well. It's not just those of us who study Russian, but it's all of us who use the internet, all of how susceptible we might be to disinformation. The fact that somebody we might be exchanging messages with might be a Russian pretending to be an American. That some of the things that we're reading might have been sent around by Twitter bots and, kind of Russian trolls employed by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which is run by a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was indicted by the FBI, after all of this in 2016. Nothing is as it seems. I mean, we can't blame the Russians for everything, but I'm just saying that, basically we shouldn't. That, they leapt in and stirred the pot here. And one of the ways of getting them out again is for us to be much more cognizant of that on the domestic front.
That's great. And I'm really, there's a lot to unpack there. And I do see some questions coming in. I just wanted to ask a couple of follow-up questions. You mentioned that none of us imagined us having these kinds of conversations 30 years ago. And I almost hate to ask this because I'm a historian. I know you were trained as a historian, and we hate counterfactual questions. But I think they're useful intellectual exercises. We've been talking about the end of the Cold War in our class, and I wonder, if you could travel back to the early 90s, what you would tell U.S. policymakers, both domestic and foreign, in terms of how to deal with Russia, because it seems to me, at least, that Washington did not foresee the rise of a global populism. There was discussion of deindustrialization and its costs. And your work in Siberia was really a compelling study of the cost of Soviet deindustrialization. But I'm kind of curious, what do you think Washington got wrong? What was not foreseen, and why was it not foreseen in terms of the types of problems we're now dealing with, and I think we're really harvesting the results of some of these omissions over the past 3 decades.
Yes, it's a great question, and I think about it all the time, and I'm not sure that I always have the best answers for it. I mean, often I actually wonder, what would it have been like if the Soviet Union hadn't come apart, if Gorbachev had succeeded with the Union Treaty in forging a new union, imperfect as it would have been, and then found a different way of devolving more power to the constituent republics, and kind of kept them together in more of a confederation, perhaps. I mean, not like the Commonwealth of Independent States was kind of cobbled together, after, or as a result of this kind of a meeting that took place right now in the Bielovechiske Pusha, in a kind of a hunting lodge I call it a hut in my book, was really a hunting lodge in the middle of, I just did for artistic license, in the middle of the Belarusian woods, with the Belarusian, Russian, Ukrainian leaders, because they just wanted to oust Gorbachev. It was really a kind of a coup, kind of internally to get rid of him and, give more power to themselves. But what if that hadn't happened? And there could have been a much more, responsive entity that emerged out there. At different points in Russian history, there was that idea of creating a kind of a United States of Eastern Europe. Different points of questions about reform of the Russian Empire, as well as, the Soviet Union. So what if it had all still been together? I think about that. Would it have held together? Because I mean, there's so much disparity and difference in the United States, of course, and kind of it's not comparable in many respects. But there are other multi-ethnic countries on small scale. I mean, the United Kingdom sometimes looks like it's unraveling as well. It could well do, and Spain and others around the world. Of course, it was huge, and with so many other contradictions and stresses and strains, but still. And I think that's kind of part of the then what happened next. Because there was all of the emergence of a whole host of independent states, and people weren't looking back perhaps into history when you had the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I, right? And the coming apart of the British Empire. That there was a lot of wars of succession and crisis afterwards, because a lot of the states hadn't been equipped, have the wherewithal to become new and independent, and there was tensions and territorial disputes that were the product of the kind of deliberate carving up of internal borders to kind of pit constituent peoples against each other. And we saw that in India. After the independence of India, you got the emergence of Pakistan and Bangladesh, and the festering of territorial disputes ever after, and religious differences, kind of really kind of creating cleavages. And India itself is still a patchwork of independent, different peoples, different ethnic groups, different languages, as well as, different religions and things as well, and lots of tensions within. So, I guess we didn't really bring the right frame to it. We kind of thought you remove the Communist Party, you remove the central planning and the system, and voila, everything kind of like all bursts out into some sort of new flourishing. Just like, when the United States cast off Great Britain, was able to move forward into kind of a whole new future. But in many respects, after 70 years in some cases of countries being linked together, or regions being linked together, because some of them weren't countries, or others being in the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Hungary, and others after World War II, all of these interdependencies emerged. And it was a pulling apart, not just an unraveling, all the trade links. I mean, we're talking now about distribution crises, right? And supply lines being broken. That's what happened when the Soviet Union came apart. Everything went through Moscow from everywhere, kind of from Uzbekistan, cotton would get sent from Tashkent to Moscow, and, things are going to back out again, for example. Kyrgyzstan, that to slaughter most of their livestock, because it was all destined for the market in Russia and and Moscow. It was kind of, there was this huge system that had emerged, just like when the United Kingdom's now trying to extricate itself from Europe. After 40 years, it's proving to be extraordinarily difficult. Things are happening that people had never thought about. And that's just exactly what we have seen over the last 30 years. We hadn't appreciated how integrated and tied together everything was. And all of the other, legacies of history, geography that would emerge. and the fact that most of the countries, Russia included, weren't really kind of equipped, didn't really have the wherewithal to operate in a whole new operating system. And we've seen that Russia always trying to kind of put things back again. That's exactly what's happening with Ukraine right now. Russia wants to kind of put it back. They want a post-Cold War settlement, but they also kind of want to sort of put things back to the 1990s and have a redo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that those are some great points. And I think, what's interesting about that is, there is this push for a new post-Cold War settlement, but also this is happening at a time when Russia is integrated and interconnected now in ways it wasn't necessarily before. I mean, there were Soviet gas connections, and oil was traded on the international markets, but now we have things like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and I just wanted to go to a couple of questions here that are touching on these issues. So one has to do with the importance of energy pipelines on Russian Western foreign policy, or Russia and Western relations, and the others have to do with, so this is, and there's another question about potential sanctions and how that could it could impact energy exports and drilling technology. So could you say a little more about how oil and gas politics are bound up in this, and how what the options are for the U.S. and the EU in terms of tackling these things, stopping pipelines, what sort of options are on the table and which are not really going to be feasible, given that we're in winter here, and it's very cold, and Europe is depending on gas from Russia.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is expansion of what we were talking about before. I mean, this with the Soviet Union itself and all of the kind of disintegration of all these connections, it wasn't just an issue of Western Europe, but all of the countries that were formerly republics in the Soviet Union were dependent on oil and gas flowing out of Moscow, rather out of Russia, with the exception of places like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, and a handful of others that had some of their oil and gas reserves and that were being developed in that sort of central planned way from the Soviet oil and gas ministry. The bulk of resources were in Russia, Siberian gas fields, oil, places like the Yamal Peninsula. And the Soviet Union had, again, under the protests of the United States, which never saw this as kind of a particularly great idea, had concluded these big energy deals with Europe, Western Europe, especially Germany, during the Cold War as well. So once the Soviet Union falls apart, you've got all these kind of artifacts of that kind of centralized system, including in oil and gas and electricity as well, electricity generation, nuclear power and nuclear power transmission, all kind of centered around those big hubs that were in the Soviet energy ministries. And that becomes a point of leverage with all kinds of the new countries that are energy poor. Some of them had their own energy resources, but they hadn't developed them, like in Ukraine, for example. That theirs hadn't been fully developed because the Soviet Union had prioritized the big fields in Siberia, Yamal, places like this, thinking about the next frontiers in the Barents Sea. There had been, of course, developments in Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere now independent, the Caspian Sea basin, but there hadn't been much development in Ukraine and other places, beyond coal, but the whole shale, next frontier. Those were all things that the Soviet Union had been planning out, but they hadn't got there yet. So we end up in this situation with all these vestiges and artifacts of a past, the lack of infrastructure for a future, and certainly future energy independence for some of these states. So you're left with a lot of leverage for a Russia that is uncomfortable with the direction that everything is headed, and does not want to have independent competitors in the energy space either, because Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and others, Azerbaijan, even become competitors for Russia in certain markets, including with Europe. And Russia doesn't really want that to happen. And now, we're in that even more competitive space. The United States, as we all well know, opposed the building of the Soviet pipelines to Europe. They opposed Nord Stream 1 as well, more recently, the direct pipeline bypassing Ukraine and Belarus from Russia to Germany. Because there was always that fear that interdependence, and these supply lines could be used for political leverage, as of course we've seen that happening. On the other side, of the ledger, the Europeans and many others obviously hope that interdependence would breed more cooperation, that more trade interdependence, more energy interdependence would kind of persuade Russia that there was more incentive to improve relationships. But as you're alluding to, this is all a double, maybe even triple-edged sword. They can leverage it. We can leverage it as well, in the opposite by imposing sanctions. And where we've got to now in terms of thinking about Ukraine and how you stop Russia from predating on Ukraine again is really in the sanctions realm. Recognizing that we're not going to put boots on the ground in any kind of major way to push back. What do we have in our arsenal? It's actually exploiting that interdependence. I talked earlier about the Russians exploiting the internet and cyberspace and trying to hack our minds and influence public opinion. We always have these financial tools as being the United States, being dominant in the global economy for now. And, always kind of think about how we can leverage the dollar and, how we can leverage the impact of our large industries and energy. We can also try to use that energy to sanction both Russian entities and those that do business with them. But it's all a very delicate balance because, still we need some kind of incentives on how to improve this relationship too. And it still is the case that there are incentives from that interdependence from Russia being able to sell energy to Europe, for there being an incentives in trade, depending on how that it's framed here. So I think we've found ourselves in quite a bind. Obviously, as you're pointing out here, Europe is still dependent on hydrocarbons for now. We've got all of these climate targets, but it's going to be a long and difficult transition away from hydrocarbons, coal, steel, gas, oil, because a lot of our metallurgy, steel industries, and other, even as we move into new forms, are still dependent on energy and energy production. And Russia, for Germany in particular, remains the main source of energy. So that huge leverage. And if we do decide to sanction the entire energy sector, we'll have global knock-on effect. Prices, of course, will be through the roof at a kind of a critical period. Other countries that are major energy producers, we've already been in spats with, like Iran, might be able to band together, as we've seen with OPEC. Of course, the Arab countries did this against us in the 1970s. We create a lot more chaos in the economic system as well. So we always have to tread very carefully and think long and hard about how we manage this. There is complexity on every front, basically. There's no easy and simple answer.
Absolutely. One of our attendees has written, as asked, as long as Putin has personal investments and assets rising, how much does he care if the Russian economy tanks? And I wanted to just follow up and ask you about, there's been a lot of targeted sanctions since 2014, and I'm kind of curious how effective you think those sanctions have been, and whether you see that as another potential leverage that could be expanded, or are we at sort of a limit in terms of what we can target individually? Have we tried that, without a tangible reaction or sort of a change in policy course from Russia?
Look, I think there's a really strong argument that when we applied sanctions collectively, and a lot of this has to be done along with everyone else and have everyone on the same page, when Russia annexed Crimea and after the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian Airlines over Ukraine, Russia at that point was thinking about moving much further into Ukraine, beyond Donbass, and into kind of the rest of Ukraine, and we might have halted them in the tracks with the sanctions. This has crimped and constrained the development of the Russian economy. It's limited options. It has pushed Russia towards China as well. There's been that impact of it. Putin hasn't had a free hand. He's had to make a lot of hard choices, but usually he chooses security over anything else. He does care very much whether the economy tanks. It's not just about the perks for him and others in the system, but then the discontent that would arise, the expectations of the population that would be dashed. Because look, in most respects now, 30 years on, Russians are living better than they've lived before. There's another, up until recently, there wasn't the same kind of persecution on any kind of mass level. I mean, Putin's really started to clamp down now in ways that they hadn't before. Russian are no longer taxed on their labor. I mean, their manual and other labor. The taxation that for the state revenues has come out of the energy and the oil and gas sector. It's been the kind of the golden goose, the cash cow, however you want to put it, for the Russian state. And any Russian living in Moscow, I mean, they kind of feel like they live in a great international city now. And more broadly, most Russians, but not all, obviously, there's massive inequality there as well, feel like they're generally living somewhat better, in a material sense, or were. And then once the economy doesn't perform anymore and real wages don't rise, you get inflation and just like things that we're concerned about here, then people start to feel that pinch and they do feel more discontent. And there's lots of grumblings of discontent and protests, labor protests and others, kind of across Russia on a mass scale. You've got these natural disasters driven by climate change, mass fires in Siberian forests, methane, emissions all over the place, sinkholes emerging as a result of this. And people feeling, particularly now with COVID and the pandemic, you can see an awful lot of lack of trust in the government there, because there's an even smaller percentage of Russians getting vaccinated than here in the United States, and partly that's because of Russia's own propaganda against the vaccines. A lot of the stuff that we read, kind of a lot of it's generated here, but a lot of it's coming from the Russians, and it's boomerang back because the Russian government wants its population to get vaccinated because it's got the highest death rates now and rates of infectivity at any time that they've had throughout the whole pandemic. This is crushing its economy as well. It's one of the reasons why Putin didn't go to Glasgow to the climate summit. I mean, he's just recently ventured out to go to India, but they're not doing well either. And so he does care about the economy. He's trying to factor all of that in. It's a very difficult set of circumstances to manage right now. So sanctions have hurt. They've limited the room for maneuver. They've tried to factor them in and adapt and be resilient. But, next waves of sanctions really would hurt. And you can be absolutely sure that Russian oligarchs and Russian, politicians who like to, have their houses in Miami and New York and send their kids to posh British, private schools, they're nervous and worried. And, one thing that we could do, which they do to us, but I'm not saying that we should. And that's kind of another do we really want to behave like them? They expropriate people. And we have, several US citizens who are, wrongfully imprisoned in Russia right now. Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan, both ex-Marines who have been, basically put there as pawns. A lot of pressure, as I said, on expropriating the assets of American and other business people. You don't see people flocking, to kind of live in Moscow from here or in Russia. And they know that they do that, with some peril where, the opposite, side, that you have lots of people coming and living in Russia from Russia, living across the United States, across the West without any kind of punishment or, pressure put on them. So, I mean, there are things that we could still do, but I'm not quite sure that we want to play Russia quite exactly the same game, because that would have,
reverberations
more broadly. But, should we really be allowing, members of the Kremlin inner circle to, be basically flouncing around wherever they want to be in Europe? And that was kind of really the impetus for some of these, personal oligarch sanctions. And there's obviously more that could be done there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, so you've touched on some of the questions that have come in from our colleague Cindy Buckley about this reactions to the vaccine in Russia, potentially as a blowback of Russian state-linked propaganda.
I think it is. Yeah.
There's a question from our colleague Ray Finch over at Fort Leavenworth about Beijing, and you touched on China, and obviously you talk about U.S. financial dominance, and we're looking at the rise of China, long rise of China. And I'm kind of curious whether you would see, he asked whether Moscow would coordinate with Beijing if they decide to invade Ukraine. And I also there's been talk about if the US really, shut down, or the West shut down financial linkages, if there could be a potential closer integration economically with China, and whether you think there's coordination there.
Well, I think on the financial instruments and pushback against sanctions, there's definitely coordination, between Russia and China, and Russia's moved more looking towards China. And I think it's propelled, more interest in cryptocurrencies and all kinds of other different payment mechanisms, outside of the realm of the dollar and the influence of the United States. So definitely, we've definitely seen a spur to that. And I think China finds what Russia does useful, because Russia is probing and testing all the time, and China can derive a lot of information from that. I think Russia, like everybody else, sees China as the future. They don't want to find themselves in any antagonistic relationship with China. There's a lot of tension and worry at the back of Russia's minds about that. I can see, just above your left ear, that part of the Russian Far East, and the whole area east of Lake Baikal and north of China, that the Amur River, that used to be China up until the 1860s. And, Russia's got a lot of tensions around that territorial mass, that, a bit of worries that somebody might do to them that they've been doing in others in terms of regathering the lands, and they haven't really enjoyed the idea of China declaring itself a near Arctic power and setting off in these transpolar expeditions and kind of moving out into spaces that Russia thinks of its own. And I think a lot of the posturing that we see that's directed sometimes and often against the United States or Japan, out in the Arctic or the Sea of Okhotsk and the Asia Pacific, is really about signaling to China, hey, we're a player here too. I've said in some other settings that there was one awkward moment among many with Trump and Putin, when there was a discussion about North Korea, and Putin said something about North Korea's border with Russia, and Trump said, "You have a border with North Korea?" Because obviously it's kind of hard to see, and I guess he was just sort of unaware that there was one. But Putin really bristled, and I mean, it was that kind of idea that Russia wasn't the player that it ought to be recognized as in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific region. And I've done a lot of acting out, since then to kind of make that point. And so, tensions with China, coordination for sure on a lot of this economic and, kind of other payment systems against sanctions. But on Crimea and Ukraine, I'm not so sure. And, China's had its own interest in investments in Ukraine. At one point, we were worried that China might buy a major Ukrainian defense manufacturer, Motorsich, that made engines. And, we've been worried about, there's a lot of interest in, Ukraine and the Ukrainian economy, just like China has a lot of interest in other places in Europe. So, again, Ukraine's been recognized for 30 years as an independent state. I do think, that what Russia did would set up a precedent for Taiwan, and that kind of the Chinese might then be concerned that we'll all react very strongly if Russia does something to shore up Taiwan, because of course Taiwan hasn't been recognized outright as an independent state, but we might become compelled to do it to be less ambiguous about the whole thing. Because what if Russia did something to Ukraine on the scale that we fear they might because of the military posturing? This would have international global reverberations. It's not just about, kind of Ukraine. This is about the whole world. And all of the territorial disputes and all the precedents that, might be set in so many different theatres. And Russia's already, kind of got away with annexation of Crimea, not that we've recognized it, but essentially they took that without anything, particularly happening apart from sanctions and other responses. They've provoked and orchestrated war in the Donbass and given people passports there, and have already incorporated Crimea into their, kind of body politic and administrative fabric. They've taken steps that, we really worry about other countries taking. Think about, the territorial disputes between India and Pakistan, for example, the future of Kashmir. What about India and China in the Himalayas? There are all kinds of other things around the globe that we would worry about as a result of something happening. And it's not clear to me that, China would necessarily be okay with this at this particular juncture. It's not just, there's also the Beijing, and the Winter Olympics coming up. And the last time Russia did something, on a major scale invasion of Georgia, there was the split screen at the opening ceremonies of the Beijing Summer Olympics. So it seems kind of, I don't think the Chinese gave a nod to them then either. And in fact, we also have seen the Chinese give cover to other states, including the Central Asian states, not to recognize under pressure from Russia Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the wake of the 2008 Georgia war. And the Chinese seem very unhappy with that, for example. So, I mean, I'm not a China scholar. I can't say for sure, but I've, heard others make this argument that, China finds, Russia very useful, but doesn't necessarily want to be put in the same Russian camp as a particular actor, and wants to be able to do, things on its own terms and not have us react because of Russia has set a precedent. So on, Crimea and Ukraine, I'm not sure, whether we could actually engage China in putting some pressure on Russia, or whether Russia is actually coordinating with China. But on other issues, absolutely, and in the United Nations and other settings as well, we see a lot of coordination between Russia and China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, concept as, China being a multi-ethnic state, as much as Beijing is uncomfortable with that, but then the linkage with Taiwan is potentially very troubling.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, what about Xinjiang, Tibet? All kinds of other question marks about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if Russia keeps pushing that issue of the acquisition of historic territories or territories with kindred peoples, I mean, China can make that case with Taiwan, but not with Xinjiang, not with Tibet, etc.
There are a few other questions about U.S. policy, and then I want to shift to talk about longer term factors and then education, which is such an important theme in your book. So some people have asked about what the U.S. could do to respond, for example, to if Russia is responsible for Havana syndrome attacks. Others have asked about what the U.S. could do to respond to cyber attacks, including those that are ransomware, so targeting corporate power rather than government institutions. Could you speak a bit about what sort of options might be out there, and how successful you could see the U.S. being in stopping these things?
I think we're actually starting to have some success on ransomware. And look, at part of it is a public-private partnership. There's been a recent articles in the press, where investigative journalists have traced a lot of the ransomware attacks back to kind of representation offices in a particular building in the financial sector of Moscow, for example. We had General Nakasone, recently giving a press briefing on kind of some of the success in rolling back some of the ransomware networks. I mean, obviously we've put Russia on notice for this because it's clear that they give at least a blind eye and haven't really tried to step up in this. So we're stepping up, and we're doing it with allies, because there's a lot of people who are very concerned about ransomware attacks outside of the US. I mean, some of them have brought the National Health Service in the UK to their into jeopardy, for example. It wasn't just the ransomware attacks, but also a lot of these intrusions, cyber intrusions, like NotPetya, which we attributed to, Russia while I was in government. We really have to pull together on the cyber front with our allies, partners, and a public-private partnership as well, because the private sector in the United States is so vulnerable here that we have to have cooperation with them. And often they're on the front line in terms of identifying a threat and being able to deal with it themselves. It's a whole different matter when we come to this issue of Havana syndrome. I mean, frankly, we don't know enough about who's doing this. And if we did get some evidence that it was Russian actors, is it being directed from the top? Did this start off as some kind of aggressive surveillance that then people discovered it could actually really hurt people? And so, maybe some decide to press ahead. Did they get the green light for this? Like we know that many of these paramilitary organizations, operate at the behest of the Kremlin and the Internet Research Agency and others, kind of subcontract, for other intelligence services. Unfortunately, we just don't know that. And of course, it would be deeply destabilizing and really turn everything on its head if we do find out that the Russians are responsible for this and are deliberately inflicting harm on US officials and representatives, diplomatic staff, etc. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that would be a whole new realm. But, unfortunately, it kind of also fits into a pattern, because, Russians have been engaged in the Russian security services and all kinds of brazen attacks that have done harm to people. It goes back to the Soviet era as well, the uses of poisons, novel agents, chemical agents, the polonium, use of polonium to kill Alexander Litvinenko, which became in effect the first dirty bomb in a Western capital, because as a result of that attack on Litvinenko, polonium was spread all over London and myriad of different places. Similarly, with the decision to use Novichok to take out Yuri Skripal and his daughter Yulia, it was kind of collateral damage there. They didn't succeed, but they did succeed in killing a British citizen, Dawn Sturgis. through the absolutely wanton disregard for human life in disposing of the vial, which is a perfume bottle that transported the Novichok in. There was enough in there to kill 4,000 people. They contaminated, most of Salisbury. These have happened in the UK, but there's been brazen assassinations in Germany, Chechens and others, kind of obviously Alexei Navalny and Novichok in his underpants. People see the things that they've done, the hit squads, that are kind of operating all over the place. And so this fits into that pattern. But it doesn't mean to say that it is them. And that's where we are right now. We have to be very careful because we just don't know, but we're working on it.
There's a question from my colleague Eve Levin about what will happen when Putin is gone, which, given his advanced age, is something we need to think about. And I'm kind of curious too, given the framing of your book, which really emphasizes some deeper structural factors, deindustrialization, growing inequality, shrinking educational opportunities. I guess one way of answering this is just to ask whether these sort of structural factors will give rise to a similar situation, and then the other is to maybe more specifically look at the playing field of Russian politics and think about who could follow Putin, and whether someone could even be potentially more strident in some of these things than Putin. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts about what a post-Putin U.S.-Russia relationship could look like.
Yeah, look, Putin is suffering from the same problems as we are. And I mean, that's why in the book I talk about the UK, US and Russia, but I could also talk about Germany and France. I mean, other European countries that were big industrial powers at the end of World War II had that major dislocation that had political impacts in the 1980s, in particular, when we moved from mass manufacturing and heavy industry into the new economy of service sector, high tech. But we're doing it again. We're going to make that another big move. And I don't think Russia's ready for that move right now to artificial intelligence and into a whole new technological era where there will be a whole shift in the way that we view work. For example, I mean, we're already grappling with it now. And, Russia hasn't shown much sign yet of the kind of innovative capacity that they need because, there is a lot of top-down effort here. The other thing is that Russia faces is that inverted population triangle. In fact, we're heading that way too in the United States because we've constrained immigration and our birth rates are slowing down like we see in most other industrialized countries. We're having these kind of major changes and, we're failing to invest in our human capital in terms of education. We've seen the Chinese make these massive investments in their education and bringing millions of people out of poverty. I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch and it's done in a rather draconian fashion, but they've recognized that making investments. And in Europe and in the European Union, there's a lot of talk about investment in population of new skills, learning, more investment in education for that next big shift. That we didn't do in the way that we should have done back in the 1980s. And what we see Russia and Putin is looking back to the past. I mean, all of this is not just looking back to the past 30 years, but even back into the imperial past. This discussion of bringing Ukraine back into the orbit, annexation of Crimea, his speech when he annexed Crimea in March of 2018, that was just ripped from, a speech that Catherine the Great might have written, and probably did, for, her annexation of Crimea. It's a kind of, he's not looking at the future, and this becomes the problem in that question. The last time he had to step away from the presidency, in 2007, he installed Dmitry Medvedev, his protege, who was, younger, different generation. Now, kind of, he won't entertain the discussion of who comes next. He's kind of put it out there that he could very well be around until 2036. Well, he will be of an advanced age. I mean, right now he's 69. By then he'll be 84. And you notice the way that he started to talk more referentially and respectfully about President Biden, when he was making fun previously about the age of President Biden and others in the United States. Well, he's changed his tune when, of course, it was pointed out that, President Biden's only 78. And by the time 2036 comes along, President Putin will be, as I said, 84. So if you kind of think that 78-year-olds can't be running the country, why are you pushing out your reign out there, so far to 2036. So he caught himself out there and has had to really change that. But the problem is that he's not offering a perspective on the future. He's put in jail Alexei Navalny, the opposition figure who was the promise of the future, totally different generation, very similar to Putin in some respects, in some of his outlook, and not calling for revolution, but the removal of the kind of kleptocratic clique around Putin, and talking about renewal and more pluralism and political participation, but with some very similar views to Putin on a whole host of other things. But he's kind of clamped up the younger generation. There are less younger people in Russia now than there were before because of birth rates dropping off, and as I said, less immigration, from around the former Soviet states, and less innovation, and still a brain drain, and COVID's having an impact here. So yeah, I think Russia is in trouble in the future because Putin isn't doing what is necessary. He's clamping down because of his fears about not being able to stay in power, and as a result, constraining the innovation and the individual agency that you kind of need to be able to move forward, to kind of allow people to come up with new ideas of where the country should go.
Speaking of the future, I do want to talk about education and the time that remains, and there are a couple of questions I want to link together in the chat. One is from Jim Heinzen, who's a professor at another public university based in New Jersey. And he points out, and this certainly holds true in Kansas, that public universities are both avenues of social mobility and lightning rods for criticism by politicians suspicious of certain types of education, particularly in the humanities. And so he is wondering if you could outline your vision of the role of public education. And then there's a question from my colleague Nathan Wood about particularly the role of area studies education, which is something that you benefited from, an interdisciplinary approach to Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia. How can we convince universities and governments to support language and area studies?
Yeah, look, I think all of this is important. As you said, I mean, I'm a product of that, and I'm in a product of humanities education as well. But I've built up on top of that a lot of other skills as well. Look, I mean, I think we have to look as education as not an episode in one's life, going to college for a 2 or 4 year term, but something that's continuous. So I think that this is kind of part of the challenge for universities, and maybe a role that public universities can play in expanding out that idea of education. I mean, we always all hear these amazing stories of people coming back, after work, in their 80s, and I just read about some guys like in his 80s who just got a PhD in astrophysics, something he'd always wanted to do. I mean, it's that kind of continuous education process, further education, new skills, learning. A humanities education really provides you with critical thinking. I mean, you have to have open debate and, the kind of the ability to discuss things openly. This is something that's missing in Russia and in China. And it's been the underpinnings of an awful lot of our innovation, including in the United Kingdom. I mean, I have friends who I studied with at St. Andrews who did, classics, and went on to run oil and gas businesses, and they would never change, the kind of path of education. After, their undergraduate degree, they went on and they proved they had critical thinking, that could master a topic, including, ancient Greek and Latin. Talk about language acquisition. I didn't try that one. But they also then went on to get other skills and training. And, most people are going to have to do that through their lives. I had been in the unusual position of having started to study Russian and then modern history, and then doing area studies where I've been able to adapt everything I've ever learned, and language study of Russian, and before that French and German. In my job, I've used every single thing that I've ever learned in my job. And I think the biggest thing for me is that expansive critical thinking. And I have tried to learn new skills. Sometimes I've done them in unconventional ways by not going back to school, but by working at the Brookings Institution with economists. People approach things in different ways. I've always sought out the opportunity to learn from someone, to work with, older, more experienced scholars like Professor Kipp. I mean, part of it is coming from where I did. My dad left school at 14 and went down the coal mines. My mom left school at 16 and became a nurse, but everybody in my family had an aspiration to learn and how to acquire knowledge. My dad in the coal mines, wanted to continue education. He had no qualifications whatsoever. The only certificate my dad had from school was a certificate of nice handwriting, which he was very proud of, and he kept it, in his drawer, because he had the certificate for the best, cursive handwriting. And he took great pride in it, even though he didn't write very much, but he was, I have the best handwriting, he did. But that was the only qualification he had, and he wanted to learn. And, he went out there and studied all kinds of things. And he went to, basically literary circles, the local Quakers and some of the Miners Association used their dues, to pay for lecture series for people. And, he would acquire a reading list. He knew more than, you might have expected on World War I, World War II. He was always trying to pick a topic that he had a personal relationship with, so we could kind of apply his own personal perspective, but he wanted to learn. And I think, throughout his life, I saw him, even without these qualifications, always picking up a book and trying to learn something. And I think that's the approach we all have to have, because this is a rapidly changing environment. We have to adapt. We have to learn new skills. And, as I've found, education has been the door that opened up everything for me. And I've applied every little bit of my knowledge. I haven't just sort of sat about, learning for learning's sake, but I've tried to kind of figure out how I can adapt what I've learned, the knowledge that I've learned in different settings. And public universities play an absolutely important role, and they can adapt, because we all have to, it's an investment in human capital. It's not just about individual attainment. I've always tried to give something back. Something else that I was instilled in me was that education was a privilege, because a lot of people didn't have access to education, but it was also a right. But if you did get an education, then you had to do something with it. And I think that's kind of the phase that we're in now. There are so many challenges in the world today, but education and educating ourselves and, becoming part of a larger network of, educated individuals are all pulling together to kind of with solutions for problems. But humanities play a very important role in that, kind of shaping critical thinking, giving you the context for the other knowledge. And area studies, for me, it's been just an amazing avenue. I got the job at the National Security Council and at the National Intelligence Council because precisely of area studies as well as language skills, because I had a larger comparative perspective to draw on. I wasn't just a narrowly focused analyst, expert, or scholar on one, specific topic.
Great. I'm sure our students will be very happy to hear that. We have about 2 minutes remaining, and I'm wondering if you could close by offering any advice you might have for students. And in particular, I'm thinking about students, who, think about your story, the class barriers, the gender barriers. How can we, build a national security community that's more inclusive of women, of underrepresented groups? So what sort of advice would you have for people from these backgrounds who are interested in pursuing a career in national security?
But the important thing is why we're doing that in the first place. It's not just to be fair and equitable. It's because we need diversity of opinion. And it gets back to that point that I said before of different perspectives that you get from, kind of a comparative perspective or area studies. We need in our national security different people's ideas. If we all have groupthink, we're not going to get anywhere. And actually, that's one of the risks that Russia is right now. Putin and the people around him are in groupthink. The great strength that we have is that we have a diversity of views and ideas, and we can bring an awful lot to the table. So that's why we need to do all of this. You need to do that in every setting. Kind of people from all kinds of backgrounds have all kinds of different ideas, and some of those might be the key to moving forward. So I think it's an imperative, not just something that we're just sort of doing, for, kind of in the interest of justice and fairness, for example. So I would say, to people who are listening here, to students, get engaged, network with others, help out your peers. Listen to people with different views, because you'll learn from them. Don't label people, don't push them back, listen, kind of to what they have to say and understand their perspective. I think the biggest thing for me, are the things that I've learned, throughout my career, is having strategic empathy. Listening to other people and trying to figure out what motivates them, why they do things that they do, why they think the things that they do. Because I've applied that from, being an outsider, my whole life, from being outside of, the class system, being female and, not part of the kind of the male environment around me, although I was often let in by my dad and my granddad. I talk about them in the book. I grew up in a very macho society in which, the men let me in. I'd sit with my granddad at the pub listening to all the old men talk about literal war stories from World War I, and just absorbing all of this and trying to understand what made them tick. And I've applied those kinds of lessons from early on to people like Putin. It's like you will understand more about the world around you, the high politics of the others, countries and other leaders, etc., in the kind of environment in which you start to work by starting now and really trying to understand other people and why people think differently. not just, negating what they think, but engaging in full discussions with them. We've always got something to learn from someone else.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful note to conclude on. I want to thank Dr. Hill so much for sharing her time with us and her expertise and her knowledge. And thanks to all of you for attending our series and for showing up in such great numbers today. Please follow crees.ku.edu for our future events. And a big thank you again to Dr. Hill. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Oh, I'm delighted. Look, I really hope I can get out to Kansas as well. I mean, all my extended family that I'm married into are from the Midwest, and I just would love to get out there and actually be there in person with all of you. I mean, I think very highly of your program. It's a fantastic program, and as I said, the public universities are really going to be the forces for change in the United States as well.
Wonderful. We'll be happy to welcome you anytime you're out in the Midwest. I didn't realize about your Midwestern family connections.
Yeah, I'm married into a family. My husband's one of 12. His family are everywhere, and they're definitely from the Midwest. I mean, his family started off in South Dakota, and they've moved everywhere.
Wonderful. Well, we'd be happy to welcome you anytime, and thank you again for joining us today.
Every best wish to everyone. Thank you.
Bye.